There is a unique mathematics to death in wartime. It's a cold, brutal arithmetic that lives not in textbooks, but on the chalkboards of squadron briefing rooms. In the summer of 1943, for the American fighter pilots of the 8th Air Force, that math was utterly unforgiving. Every mission over occupied Europe was an equation, and the answer was almost always loss. Imagine you are there, sealed in the cockpit of a P-47 Thunderbolt, the rumble of its 2,000 horsepower engine a living thing around you. Your altimeter reads 18,000 feet. Below, France is a beautiful, serene patchwork of farmland and forest. You can see for 100 miles. You feel powerful. You feel untouchable. You are catastrophically wrong, because in these skies, at this exact altitude, you are not the hunter. You are the prey. Between June and September of 1943, the 8th Air Force bled 214 fighter aircraft. They weren't lost to storms or engine failure. They were being systematically dismantled by an enemy who owned this airspace. The veterans of the Luftwaffe, flying their nimble Messerschmitt Bf-109s and deadly Focke-Wulf 190s, had been fighting here since 1940. This was their home turf. They had perfected a tactic called the bounce. A German pilot would position himself miles away, using the sun's blinding glare as a cloak. He would then dive, a silent predator plummeting at over 400 miles per hour. The first warning an American pilot had was the percussive thunder of 20mm cannon shells tearing his aircraft and his body apart. Before the P-47's wingman could even react, the German fighter was climbing back into the sun, a ghost returning to its lair. The mess halls at bases across England grew quieter. Every evening there were more empty chairs. The tactical doctrine the Americans had been taught, the gospel they followed religiously, was simple. Altitude is life. Never give up your height. Fight in the vertical. It was a sound theory, written by experts in classrooms, thousands of miles away. And over the skies of France, it was getting everyone killed. The question, hanging in every briefing, spoken or not, was terrifyingly simple. How do you fight an enemy you can't see, in a sky they've already mastered? In the 56th Fighter Group, a man named Major Hubert Zemp was tired of watching his pilots die. He was a commander who saw the faces behind the statistics, who knew the names attached to the empty chairs. He looked at the brutal math on the chalkboard and realized the equation itself was wrong. The American doctrine wasn't just failing. It was a beautifully logical blueprint for suicide. Zemp began to contemplate the unthinkable. He started to flirt with heresy. Every tactical manual, every instructor, every veteran pilot preached the religion of altitude. What if, he thought, the gospel was the problem? What if the solution wasn't up in the thin, cold air where they were being slaughtered? What if the answer was down? All the way down. The idea was patently insane. To fly low was to surrender every known advantage. You couldn't see threats coming. Your energy state was abysmal. One moment of inattention, one slight miscalculation, and your aircraft would become a crater in the French countryside before you could even register your mistake. Worse, flying low and slow made you a perfect, predictable target for German anti-aircraft guns. The dreaded flak. Every fiber of a pilot's training screamed that low-level flight for a single-engine fighter was a death sentence. But Hub Zemp looked at the ever-growing list of lost pilots, at the 214 aircraft that had vanished in a single summer, and he asked the most pragmatic question of the war. Compared to what? The current method wasn't working. Staying high was already a death sentence. Maybe, just maybe, the most dangerous idea was also the only one that offered a chance of survival. He needed men willing to forget everything they'd ever learned to commit an act of supreme tactical defiance. He needed volunteers for what looked, on paper, like a suicide mission. The only question was, who would be crazy enough to fly it? In late September 1943, Zemk quietly pulled aside 3 of his most trusted and aggressive pilots, Captain Walker Bud Mahirin and Lieutenants Bob Johnson and Jerry Johnson. There was no formal briefing, no grand speech. He laid out the grim reality and then proposed his heresy. Forget altitude discipline. The next time you're out after the bombers are safe, I want you to drop, not to 10,000 feet, not to 5. I want you to put your altimeter on the deck, skim the trees, see what happens. He made them a solemn promise. If they were court-martialed for violating every rule in the book, he would take the fall. The 3 pilots looked at each other. Each of them had lost friends in the last month. They had all been bounced. They had all felt that chilling helplessness as a wingman's plane erupted in flame. They understood the current math. They agreed. On September 27, 1943, 3 P-47 Thunderbolts broke away from their formation high above France. They nosed over and began a terrifying dive from the relative safety of 18,000 feet down. Down, down, until the world outside their canopies was no longer a map, but a green, rushing blur. They leveled out at 200 feet, throttles jammed forward, traveling at 350 miles per hour. French farmers working in their fields threw themselves into ditches as the 7-ton fighters screamed overhead. And then, something happened that would change the course of the air war. Through a break in the trees, they saw it. A German airfield near Beauvais, with Focke-Wulf 190s lined up neatly, like toys. On the ground, the Luftwaffe was blind. They were looking up, scanning the high altitudes, completely oblivious to the threat roaring towards them at propeller height. The 3 P-47s became Reapers. They swept across the field, their 8 50 caliber machine guns hammering in unison. 4 FW-190s disintegrated into fire and shrapnel before the German anti-aircraft gunners could even process what was happening and run to their positions. The 3 Americans pulled up slightly, stayed low, and vanished back into the landscape. They made it home without a scratch. The score was for kills, 0 losses. But it was more than that. It was proof. An insane idea had just become a terrifying new reality. They had discovered that flying low wasn't a suicide pact, it was a weapon. And they were about to teach the world the brutal science of surprise. This new tactic wasn't just about avoiding the enemy above. It was about weaponizing the very ground beneath them, turning every German advantage into a fatal liability. The rules of aerial combat, written for the vast, three-dimensional arena of the upper atmosphere, simply collapsed at 50 feet. First, it killed the Luftwaffe's eyes. Across occupied France, the Germans had a sophisticated network of Freya and Würzburg radar stations. They could detect Allied formations from 80 miles out, giving them ample time to vector their fighters to the perfect altitude and position for an attack. But radar waves travel in straight lines, and the Earth is curved. Below 500 feet, a P-47 vanished from their screens, disappearing into a noisy, chaotic mess that operators called ground clutter. The radar returns, bouncing off hills, buildings, and trees. At 50 feet, a Thunderbolt ceased to exist. It became a ghost of aluminum and horsepower, screaming across France at 6 miles a minute, completely invisible. Second, it killed time. Picture a German ace at a forward airfield, sitting in his cockpit, engine warming for a morning patrol. With radar warning of a high-altitude sweep, he'd get a 3-minute heads-up. Plenty of time to take off, form up, and prepare for battle. But at 50 feet, the first warning he received was not the crackle of a radio, but the raw, soul-shaking sound of a Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine howling over the tree line. From the moment that sound registered to the moment of impact, he had 11 seconds. Not enough time to scramble to his plane. Not enough time to man the flak guns. Barely enough time to comprehend that his war was over. American pilots began catching entire squadrons on the ground. Pilots still climbing into cockpits. Ground crews frozen in disbelief. It wasn't combat. It was an execution. Finally, it twisted the laws of physics into a defensive shield. The German flak crews were experts, trained to calculate the lead time for a target moving at high altitude. They fired where the target was going to be. But at treetop level, at 350 miles per hour, those calculations became meaningless. By the time an 88mm shell arrived at the predicted point in space, the P-47 was already a quarter of a mile past it. Even if a German fighter managed to spot you and dive to engage, he was entering your world, governed by your rules. At 50 feet, there is no room for error. Every aggressive maneuver he made, every turn to bring his guns to bear, brought him fractions of a second from plowing into a hillside or a church steeple. The American pilot wasn't just evading guns. He was forcing the German to constantly choose between killing him and killing himself. The psychological pressure was immense and completely reversed. The hunter, terrified of the unforgiving ground, became the hunted. The ground itself had become the American's greatest wingman. The irony was that the P-47 Thunderbolt, the plane at the heart of this revolution, was never designed for it. Republic Aviation had built a monster, a 7-ton behemoth, nicknamed the Jug, that was intended to be a high-altitude bomber escort. Its massive engine and state-of-the-art turbocharger were optimized for performance in the thin, cold air of 25,000 feet. When pilots first started dragging these thoroughbreds down into the mud, they came back with their airframes shredded. Belly panels were ripped open, oil coolers were punctured by tree branches, and propellers were bent from clipping the ground. But they came back. The Jug was tough. It could absorb unbelievable punishment that would have atomized a Spitfire or a mess. The engineers at Republic realized they had accidentally built the most brutally effective low-level attacker in the world. They just needed to finish the job. The modifications began. Starting in late 1943, sheets of quarter-inch armor plating were added to the P-47's belly and lower engine cowling. This wasn't to stop bullets. It was protection against France. Pilots were literally smashing through the tops of trees and flying home. Reinforced brackets were added around the oil cooler. One pilot, Francis Gabreski, landed with a 6-foot tree branch wedged in his landing gear. The armor had saved the critical hydraulic lines. The gun sight was changed. The standard sight was designed for deflection, shooting at distant, maneuvering targets. Now, the targets were stationary trucks and parked aircraft, visible for only a second or two. The new K-14 gyroscopic sight, essentially a primitive computer, allowed a pilot to simply place the dot on the target and squeeze the trigger. 8 .50 caliber machine guns would erase whatever was under the pipper. But the most critical modification wasn't mechanical. It was human. A new training school was established at Atcham, England. Its purpose was to untrain every instinct a pilot had. Replacement pilots were forced to fly for hours at 50 feet across the English countryside, learning to read terrain at speeds where a moment's hesitation meant death. They practiced snap shooting at ground targets until it was pure muscle memory. The instructors were the battle-hardened survivors from the first few months over France. Their lesson was simple and grim. Altitude kills you. Speed saves you. and the jug can take a beating that would kill any other plane. Trust your aircraft, master the ground, and you might just live to go home. April 8, 1944. This was the day the music died for the Luftwaffe in France. For 6 months, Hub Zemk had quietly, methodically forged his new weapon. He had rotated pilots through the brutal school at Aachen, studied intelligence reports, and waited. He was no longer just a tactician. He was the conductor of a symphony of destruction, and he was about to begin his performance. Intelligence confirmed that 2 of the Luftwaffe's elite fighter wings were resting and refitting at forward airfields in Normandy. The Germans considered these bases safe, tucked miles inland, protected by rings of flak and radar. Zemk unleashed 48 P-47s from 3 fighter groups. There were no bombers to escort. Their only mission was to hunt. After crossing the coast, the formation broke apart into smaller flights, dropping down to the deck. They thundered across the Norman countryside, 4-ship elements appearing and disappearing between hills and forests. French resistance spotters later reported that the ground itself seemed to shake. The first flight hit the airfield at Evro. 16 Bf 109s were on the ground, being refueled and rearmed. The P-47s materialized out of the morning haze at 360 miles per hour. In 90 seconds of controlled, disciplined violence, 11 German fighters were turned into burning hulks. Then the Americans were gone. The genius of the attack was its timing. As chaos erupted at Evero and frantic warnings were sent by radio, other American flights were already hitting their targets. Bernay was struck 8 minutes later. Bergmann-Uri for minutes after that. The Luftwaffe's command and control system, so effective against high-altitude formations, collapsed into chaos. They were trying to vector fighters to intercept ghosts that had already struck and vanished. It was like trying to swat a swarm of hornets with a sledgehammer, while the hornets were tearing your house apart. By noon, P-47s had ravaged 7 different airfields. The German pilots who managed to get airborne found themselves alone, chasing phantoms in a sky where one mistake meant instant disintegration against the landscape. This was more than a raid. It was a massacre, and it announced to the world that for the Luftwaffe in France, nowhere was safe. In Berlin, General Adolf Galland, the respected commander of Germany's fighter forces, read the after-action reports from April 8th and understood immediately. His air force was facing an existential threat. Losing planes in aerial combat was the cost of war. But losing them on the ground, along with the trained pilots, the irreplaceable ground crews, the fuel and the ammunition, that was an arterial bleed that could not be stopped. Germany's collapsing industry could not keep pace. Galland issued a series of increasingly desperate directives. He ordered flak batteries to be moved a kilometer out from the airfields, hoping to catch the P-47s on their approach. It didn't work. The American pilots simply used the terrain to fly even lower, popping up inside the flak envelope, destroying the guns, and then disappearing again. One German flak commander reported losing 17 men in 3 weeks without scoring a single hit. He ordered the establishment of a network of visual observers, some coerced French civilians, to telephone warnings of approaching aircraft. This gave the Germans perhaps 30 extra seconds of warning, just enough time for pilots to sprint away from their aircraft before they were destroyed. The French resistance quickly infiltrated the network, feeding false reports that sent German bases into a panic over ghost attacks, while the real P-47s hit targets 50 miles away. His most desperate measure was dispersal. Instead of parking aircraft efficiently near runways, ground crews began hiding individual fighters in barns, in tree groves, under camouflage nets, scattered for miles around the airfield. While this did save some planes from being strafed, it destroyed their operational readiness. A fighter hidden in a barn 2 kilometers away could unrespond to a threat for at least 20 minutes. The Americans had forced the Luftwaffe to choose between protecting their aircraft and using them. They chose protection, effectively grounding their own air force. Galland watched, helpless, as his elite fighter wings were systematically paralyzed. Not by superior aircraft, but by a superior idea. For the American pilots, survival at 50 feet was a brutal education in a new kind of fear. The enemy was no longer just the Luftwaffe. It was everything. It was a flock of birds exploding through your canopy at 350 miles per hour. Pilots called them flying flak. It was the unseen power lines strung between poles, thin wires that could slice through a wing like a razor. The 8th Air Force lost 9 P-47s to power line strikes in 2 months, not combat losses. Just administrative casualties listed as struck obstacle during low-level flight. The psychological toll was immense. Every combat pilot lives with the fear of dying. But this was compounded by the fear of dying stupidly. At 20,000 feet, if you were shot down, it was an honorable death in battle. A letter would be written to your family about your heroism. At 50 feet, if you died, it was likely because you misjudged a hillside, failed to see a chimney, or got distracted for a fraction of a second. Your wingman would simply report, "Flew into the ground." Everyone would know you made a mistake. This relentless pressure created a unique form of exhaustion. A pilot's body was flooded with adrenaline for 2 solid hours. His eyes strained to process the world rushing toward him at 500 feet per second. His hands and arms made constant, tiny corrections to keep the massive aircraft stable. After a mission, pilots would be soaked in sweat, their hands trembling so badly they couldn't hold a coffee cup steady. Some requested transfers back to high-altitude bomber escort. Choosing to face the German aces, they could see over another duel with a French telephone pole they saw too late. A healthy fear was what kept you alive. The ones who lost that fear, the ones who got too confident, and started flying under bridges just for the thrill, they always became a statistic. June 6, 1944, D-Day. As dawn broke over the Normandy coast, the success of the largest amphibious assault in human history rested on one single, massive gamble made by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, that the Allies would have absolute control of the sky. He was betting the entire invasion on the promise of air supremacy. And the hedge-hopping P-47 pilots were about to cash that check. Before the first landing craft hit the sand, 289 Thunderbolts were already over France. This was the culmination of everything they had learned. It was a coordinated, rolling wave of destruction against every German airfield within 150 miles of the beaches. The strikes began at 4:45 a.m., catching the Luftwaffe as they were preparing their dawn patrols. At airfields across northern France, the same scene played out. German pilots, canopies open, going through their pre-flight checks, died without ever knowing they were under attack. The P-47s materialized from the pre-dawn gloom, conducted their lethal business, and vanished. The German command system didn't just break down, it ceased to exist. By 8 a.m., as American soldiers were fighting for their lives on Omaha Beach, the Luftwaffe had managed to put exactly 2 aircraft over the entire invasion fleet. They were shot down in minutes. Hitler spent the morning raging, demanding to know where his air force was. The answer was simple. It was burning. It was burning on airfields that the hedgehoppers had turned into graveyards. Throughout the day, the P-47s shifted from airfields to anything that moved toward Normandy. They hunted trains, truck convoys, and panzer columns. A flight led by Francis Gabreski caught a German tank column on the road and, using armor-piercing incendiary rounds, brewed up 3 tanks, scattering the rest. Reinforcements that should have reached the beaches in hours took days, harried and destroyed from the air every step of the way. On D-Day, the Allies flew over 14,000 sorties. The Luftwaffe flew 319. That staggering difference wasn't just industrial might. It was the legacy of a single, insane idea, perfected over 7 brutal months at 50 feet above the ground. The revolution, born in the skies of France, did not end with the war. It fundamentally rewrote the doctrine of air power. The concept of close air support was no longer a secondary mission. It was a battle-winning capability. The lessons learned by P-47 pilots were applied by pilots flying F-8 for jets in Korea, screaming low over the frozen countryside. The speeds were higher, the technology different, but the ghost of the Thunderbolt flew with them. The tactics were refined by 7 Corsair pilots over the dense jungles of the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Vietnam, where Napotherth flying became the new term for the same deadly art. The ultimate expression of this legacy is a modern aircraft. The A-10 Warthog, it is, in spirit, the P-47's direct descendant. Built around a massive cannon, heavily armored underneath, and designed to fly low and slow, it is the embodiment of every lesson learned in 1944. It is an aircraft built on the principle that the ground is not an obstacle, but an ally. When you visit the Air Force Museum today, you might see a P-47 Thunderbolt hanging from the ceiling. The placard will talk about its role as a high-altitude escort, and while that is true, it is an incomplete story. The Thunderbolt's true greatness was realized when it did the one thing it was never designed to do, when its pilots, faced with unacceptable losses, had the courage to throw out the rule book and point their noses at the ground. Hub Zemp was never court-martialed. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. His heresy became the new gospel, a lasting lesson that when doctrine fails, true victory belongs to the innovators, the experimenters, and the brave. The air war in Europe was won not just at 20,000 feet, but at 50 feet, one burning airfield at a time.